The identity of Mrs. Flood is the single biggest mystery in Doctor Who right now. I want to know who Mrs. Flood is, you want to know who Mrs. Flood is, your cat wants to know who Mrs. Flood is. We all want to know who Mrs. Flood is. Answers are coming in Season 2, so we don't have too much longer to wait. But until then, get your big fluffy white coats on and let's go over some of the biggest theories about this all-powerful pensioner. Number 10. She picked up the Master's tooth. Officially, Mrs. Flood first appeared in The Church on Ruby Road. But could she actually have made her debut one story earlier? In The Giggle, we learn that the Toymaker fought the Master and imprisoned him in his impressively shiny gold tooth. Following the Toymaker's defeat, that tooth was retrieved from the unit helipad by a very well-manicured hand that appeared to be floating off the side of the building. We've been here before, of course. A similar-looking hand rescued the Master's ring following his first encounter with the 10th Doctor, allowing him to live on. So it seems someone is planning to resurrect the Master all over again, and a character as seemingly nefarious as Mrs. Flood may just fit the bill. Maybe she's the one who picked up the tooth in the first place, with the aid of her Mary Poppins-esque umbrella, and she's just waiting for the right moment to use it. Another possibility is that this resurrection has already taken place, and Mrs. Flood actually is the Master. Maybe there was a chameleon arch situation going on, and seeing the TARDIS disappear in the church on Ruby Road triggered Mrs. Flood's Master memories back. This would be quite a different and unusual depiction for the Master, and though a somewhat predictable twist, you can't deny that Anita Dobson would absolutely slay as the Doctor's arch frenemy. Number 9. She's one of the pantheon of gods. Lots of fans believe Mrs. Flood to be another of RTD2's godlike entities, which would make sense considering that these gods have been a huge part of this era so far. To that end, Mrs. Flood could easily be one of the gods mentioned by Harriet Arbinger in The Legend of Ruby Sunday. Wouldn't that be such a cheeky Russell T Davies flourish to hide the answer in plain sight? Contenders include Reprobate, the god of spite, Incensor, the god of disaster, together with her children, Doubt and Dread, the unnamed gods of skin, shame and secrets, and the threefold deity of malice, mischief and misery. Mrs. Flood could conceivably align with any of these, though the most obvious fit would surely be Incensor given the biblical connotations of her name. Think Noah's Ark. But then what are Doubt and Dread, and what disaster is Mrs. Flood conjuring up? Remember that RTD first name-dropped Triad Technology in The Giggle, a company that became very relevant in the Season 1 finale. So name-dropping all these gods here could have been a similar way of planting seeds for the future. And with Mrs. Flood displaying godlike powers already, a link with the Pantheon is a really solid bet. Number 8. Her front door leads to the Time Hotel. One of the biggest missed opportunities of Joy to the World was not having Mrs. Flood cameo as a Time Hotel guest. She was literally carrying a suitcase the last time we saw her. But maybe that didn't happen because there's a reveal here that's yet to come. The theory that Mrs. Flood is actually the Sandringham Hotel manager and 15th Doctor's bestie Anita Benn gained traction pretty quickly in late 2024. And it's not hard to see why. For one thing, Anita shares a name with Anita Dobson, and she looks pretty similar too. And Mrs. Flood's comment about having seen a TARDIS before could easily refer to all the Doctor's police box trinkets. There's also the fact that Mrs. Flood's front door, which was once teased as significant by Russell T Davies, is TARDIS blue and could possibly be a portal to the Time Hotel itself. Not to mention that aforementioned suitcase, which had all sorts of travel stickers all over it, which Mrs. Flood could have easily acquired if she was involved with the Time Hotel. It's a nice bit of headcanon, but it's perhaps one of the more outlandish Mrs. Flood theories out there. We also have a video breaking down this theory in greater detail, so do go and check that out if you want to hear more all about that theory. Number 7. She isn't a villain. Most of the speculation around Mrs. Flood points to her being some sort of threat to the Doctor. But what if she's the exact opposite? Shortly before getting dusted by Sutekh, she told Cherry Sunday that she had such plans. Plans that are presumably now back on the agenda. She also called the Doctor a clever boy and said that his journey will end in absolute terror. Now, sure, a lot of this might seem quite ominous, but if you look at the full picture, there's nothing that definitively suggests that she's a force of evil. In fact, her clearly not being being aligned with Sutekh and celebrating her undusting with Cherry suggests that she's more of a solo operation, maybe with a few shades of grey in there, but nothing as sinister as the God of Death and his allies. As for her plans and that absolute terror, Mrs. Flood could easily be working to save the Doctor from that fate, rather than being the one who causes it. Like how Karvanista and Lupari initially seemed to be invading Earth, but were actually very good dogs working to protect the humans from the Flux. And let's face it, she's evil because you thought she was evil would be a very on-brand twist for this era. Number 6, she's linked to the Trickster. Could the answer to Mrs. Flood's identity lie in an unmade storyline from one of Doctor Who's spin-offs? On 2 separate occasions in the Season 1 finale, we see the Sunday's radio clock glitch. While this may just have been a side effect of Sutekh's presence, we can't discount the possibility that it's something more significant, much like the TARDIS groaning in the 60th anniversary and Season 1. And one common link between both clock glitches is Mrs. Flood, who on both occasions appears in the following shot. Another character who had a funny relationship with electricity was Skye, the child left on Sarah Jane's doorstep in Series 5 of the Sarah Jane Adventures. Now, originally this was going to build to the reveal that Skye was the child of Sarah Jane's greatest enemy, the Trickster, but this storyline never transpired on screen due to the Sarah Jane Adventures' premature end. Some fans were convinced that RTD was reviving this plot for Season 1, due to Ruby also being abandoned as a child. That didn't come to pass, but maybe we had the wrong person, and Russell once teased on Twitter that he has greater plans for the Trickster, so now's as good a time as any. If Mrs. Flood is a grown-up Skye, she could be the latest member of the Trickster's brigade, serving as his harbinger. It's an elaborate setup worthy of the newly minted God of Traps. Number 5, she's the Doctor's mother. The Timeless Child has continued to play a big part in RTD2, with the Doctor's status as a foundling becoming a plot point in Wild Blue Yonder and serving as a direct parallel to Ruby's journey in Season 1. So far, no more has been revealed about the Doctor's family, but we have had further references to him being a father and a grandfather, Susan's first name drop in decades, and the Doctor himself stating that he's more interested in his own family these days. It all seems to be building to something, and it's tempting to imagine that we've already met a member of the Doctor's family hidden in plain sight, and that person might be Mrs. Flood. Sure, she could just be a new version of Susan, but the way she watches over the Doctor in the church on Ruby Road and talks about him in Empire of Death points to something a bit more maternal. She could be the Doctor's biological mother, finally putting in an appearance, or even his adoptive Gallifreyan mother, both of whom could have found their way back to him after those Toymaker line of salt shenanigans. Again, with the Timeless Child continuing to resonate during RTD2, maybe mothers are on Russell's mind. He also basically included the Doctor's mother in The End of Time, so it wouldn't be completely unprecedented. Number 4, she's one of the Guardians. For her most recent appearance, Mrs. Flood swapped her usual granny get-up for a fetching fur coat. Fans were quick to point out a resemblance to the costume worn by Romana in her first story, but it also brings to mind the White Guardian, another character first seen in that same story, who is responsible for maintaining universal order and exists in opposition to the Black Guardian, the embodiment of chaos. If Mrs. Flood is a returning character, the Guardians would be a suitably epic choice, and given that the Black Guardian has posed as the White Guardian in the past, she could conceivably be either of them. Now, the reason this theory has weight behind it is that Forbidden Planet recently released a range of Black Guardian-themed merch, which renamed him the Guardian of Chaos, a name that sounds like something straight out of RTD2, like how the Toymaker is now the God of Games. And why would an old villain need renaming if not to tee them up for a future appearance? Is this just a case of a licensee trying to tap into current television storylines? An unrelated coincidence, or maybe something more? It certainly wouldn't be the first time that a 4th Doctor villain has been reimagined for the 15th Doctor's era, just saying. Number 3, she's the God of Stories. One of the most intriguing things about Mrs. Flood is her tendency to break the fourth wall. We've seen this happen multiple times now, and it always has Mrs. Flood function much like a Greek chorus, reflecting on recent events and dropping hints about what's to come. RTD has insisted that these asides are just a bit of fun, which might never be explained. However, they do tie into a wider point about Mrs. Flood knowing about things she shouldn't, from TARDISes to Sutekh. She even seems to know what fate befalls the Doctor. But does she just know this stuff, or is she controlling it? According to one theory, it's the latter, and Mrs. Flood is the god of stories, an omniscient being to whom the Doctor's adventures are merely a fictional narrative. Now, from this perspective, she could have orchestrated all manner of things, from the Doctor meeting Ruby to his bigeneration. She could even be connected to the land of fiction, a make-believe world previously seen in the second Doctor serial, The Mind Robber, which is long overdue a comeback. Gods are obviously a big thing in RTD2, so it ticks that box as well. And once again, we have a full video breaking down this theory too in even greater detail, so do check that one out if you want to hear more too. Number 2, she's a pre-Hartnell Doctor. The legend of Ruby Sunday contained a moment that led many to believe that Mrs. Flood was a Time Lord. It all started when the Doctor told Ruby that she might not recognise Susan if he met her again because Time Lords sometimes hide ourselves away. Then, a few seconds later, Mrs. Flood said she was pleased to get out of the house because she's always hiding herself away. If there is a twist at the end, the biggest twist of all would be if Mrs. Flood is actually the Doctor. RTD has said that he wants to expand on the Timeless Child storyline, and this would be the logical way to do that. We've seen pre-Hartnell Doctors hiding on Earth before, and this would also explain why Mrs. Flood was familiar with TARDISes in the general sense, but not the police box disguise of the Doctor's ship, because from her point of view, it doesn't look like that yet. Hell, maybe Mrs. Flood's house is her TARDIS, giving her TARDIS blue front door a somewhat literal meaning, and also explaining Russell's comment about her door being significant. Hopefully this is true, if for no other reason than we'd be able to call her Dobson Doctor, which just has a really nice ring to it, doesn't it? Number 1, she killed the Meep. As well as Romana and the White Guardian, Mrs. Flood's fur coat evoked a certain furry fugitive encountered by the 14th Doctor. But what reason would she possibly have to cosplay the Meep? Well, as we all know, the identity of the Meep's boss, who was possibly also Rogue's new employer, is yet to be confirmed. We all assumed it was some big space cartel leader. But what if it's actually Mrs. Flood? It's certainly easy to imagine her watching the events of the Star Beast unfold from her front door, rubbing her hands together with glee. And here's where it gets much darker. As part of their cover story, the Meep claimed that the Wrath Warriors had been skinning Meep kind for their fur. That ended up being a load of rubbish, but their skin could have been removed by someone else, say their boss, as punishment for failing to avoid recapture, maybe? In other words, Mrs. Flood is wearing a lovely toasty Meep fur coat. Remember as well that the boss was apparently quite interested in two-hearted beings, and Mrs. Flood herself seems very interested in the Doctor. It would also make sense for the boss to be someone we've already met, as that would then give the reveal more significance and connect some of the dots that are flying around. So is Mrs. Flood the worst boss in the Whoniverse? Only time will tell, but there can't be too many places you can get a coat like that, surely. And there you have it, there's our 10 theories, but I'm sure there are more, so do let me know your theories on who Mrs. Flood is in the comments down below. In the meantime, I've been Ellie for Who Culture, and in the words of River Song herself, goodbye, sweeties. Never seen a theory video before?